Welcome back everyone, and Happy New Year. It's a bit late into the new year, but I wanted to do my usual wrapping up of the best books that I read this year. I didn't read as much this year as I usually do, but there were still some great books, and really none that I hated, although there were one or two, but I'm not going to do a video focusing on the negatives, just a video focusing on the positives. So let's start with a book that I really enjoyed reading and did so quite recently, and that is The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. So this is the story of Mary Lennox, not a very nice girl who lived in India until her parents tragically die of cholera, and she is sent to live with her uncle in the north of England in a mansion. He's a very reclusive figure. His wife died, and she had this garden, and he forbids anyone to go inside. And Mary is very lonely in this mansion, and she eventually finds this garden, and she begins to nurture it. And slowly, as she nurtures the garden, she starts to look inward on herself, reflect on her own morality, and slowly she becomes a better person. She also forms some friendships along the way as well. This is a fantastic children's book in my view. What I like about it is the way that you have this girl who is not a great character, which, in a lot of kids' literature, the kid is always someone who you root for. They're always this plucky young thing, feisty and great. But that's not the case in The Secret Garden. Mary is a horrible child, and it's really a story of a child becoming self-aware for the first time, which I think is a really important transitional moment from being a child to being an adult. It's that time when you start to look inwards and think that you're not a perfect person, that you might be in the wrong, and that you slowly start to develop morally. And I think that's what makes this such a great story. I also love a story that is about the outdoors and encouraging people to go outside, and that's another thing that this story has in it, which I think is really important these days when we spend more and more time inside, and sometimes it's really nice just to go out, look at nature, or in this case, tend to nature. So a great little story, and I'm glad that I finally read it after years of really liking the film from the 90s. I finally got round to reading the book, and it didn't disappoint. Next on the list is a book that I'm going to be reviewing very soon, and that is Barnaby Rudge by Charles Dickens. This is his first historical novel, and I believe his fifth novel, and it tells the story of the Gordon riots, which were a series of riots that happened in the 1700s, and essentially there was some act, I can't remember what the act was called now off the top of my head, but there was an act that was being placed by Parliament, and it was basically going to encourage people to stop or make it harder to discriminate against Catholics. And Lord George Gordon didn't like this. He started a series of riots about it, and that is what Barnaby Rudge is about. But rather than just focusing on the historical side, Dickens spends a lot of time building up the personal narratives of a lot of characters, including the title character, Barnaby Rudge, who is I think he's about 20 years old, but he's quite simple-minded. He clearly has some kind of mental health condition, and he gets swooped into these riots as well, as do the other characters that we meet. So it explores how the riots affect the personal lives of these characters who were drawn into it. It was regarded at the time as Dickens' first flop, and I have to say that when I first read it, it was the first Dickens novel. Most Dickens novels are quite long, but this is the first time that I really felt the length of the novel. It's also structured kind of oddly, because you have the build-up of these characters and their personal lives, and then it just sort of erratically jumps into the riots. And while the riots themselves are absolutely amazing, the way that Dickens describes them, incredibly brutal, incredibly dark, if you like that side of Dickens, then I think you will like at least the riot section of this book. I'm just not sure that the whole thing hangs together very well, or at least I wasn't at first. But as ever, when I review Dickens especially, or when I review longer books, I do like to read them twice, just so that I can be sure of what's going on and how I feel about them. And so on my second read through, I actually found that I liked it a lot more because I knew what was coming, so I didn't have the wrong expectations going into the book. And so I actually appreciated the book a lot more, and I really do think that the latter half is really good. I still have some problems with it, and it's probably my least favourite Dickens, but it was an interesting read, and that's why I wanted to put it on the list. Next up we have a book that I abandoned and then picked up again, and I'm glad that I did because it completely changed my view of it, and that is The Fellowship of the Ring. Now I actually read this entire book before I abandoned the series. I gave up maybe at the beginning or so of The Two Towers, and I just wasn't feeling The Lord of the Rings at all. I think because it had been sold to me as this amazing work, this foundational work in fantasy literature with these amazing characters and all the rest, and sometimes when people do that, then you listen to it and it can never live up to the expectations. So I ended up just abandoning it. But then I decided again recently I'm going to try this again, and because my expectations were lowered this time, I actually really appreciate the story, and it completely blew my mind in a way that I wonder how I even thought what I thought when I first read it. Because when I first read it, I just found it dull. And that just wasn't the case this time. The story of Frodo, the way that Tolkien spends a long time setting up him as a character, setting up the Shire and Frodo's time there, setting up everything up to the build-up to the Fellowship actually meet. There's so much story there. A lot of it, some of it even cut from the films. And so I appreciated that a lot more. The first time I read it, I think I just thought it was slow and dull. But actually, that detail, that rich world building, is amazing and really is some of the best fantasy writing that I've ever come across. Because although it is slow, it doesn't come across as if he's just piling information on you in a way that's not organic. It feels very organic. And actually I felt a lot more for Frodo as a character because Tolkien spent so much time building up his history, his time in the Shire, before we get to the adventure itself. And so it completely changed my expectations, which I'm glad about. I always like it when a book does that. And I'm looking forward to very soon starting with The Two Towers, and hopefully my enthusiasm will continue. Next up is a little bit of a cheat, and also sort of not true, but I wanted to put it in, and that is the Final Trilogy of Anne Rice books. So that is everything from Prince Lestat to the Realms of Atlantis book to Blood Communion. Now, these 3 books Rice wrote, I think it was like 2014 to 2018 or something like that, and they deal with the final adventures of Lestat as the vampire king, as he becomes at the end of the first book, and then we deal with the true history of the vampires in the realms of Atlantis and where they came from. It's not where you think it is. It's up in the sky rather than in the sort of more Egyptian mythology that Rice began with. And then we end up with Blood Communion, which just sort of ties everything together and ends in a very optimistic way. And although I didn't really like Prince Lestat as a book, I think it was one of the weaker entries in the Vampire Chronicles series. I thought it was meandering. I thought there were too many new characters to the point where it was hard to really relate to any of them. And while there were some interesting bits, it just didn't hang together in my view. I did appreciate the other 2 books. I think The Realms of Atlantis is just, yes, bizarre, and I'm not sure that I love the change of direction for the vampires on reflection. I quite liked the Akasha story. I liked that as the creation of the vampires. That being said, I do like Rice's ability to just do something fresh and different, and I like the story of Atlantis that she tells, and I wish there was a bit more of that, actually. And then with Blood Communion, again, I think it's a short, punchy way to just end the series. It's a bit optimistic, for a series that's typically known for its darkness, but it works really well, and it's quite a happy, nice ending. And so I wanted to put just the final trilogy on this book. I've been reading these books for a long time now, and it was great to finally get to the end and finish the series this year. And I'm glad that the series finished on a high, because there were quite a few books in that middle period where I was really losing steam for the series, and I wasn't even sure after reading Prince Lestat that I would carry on reading, because a lot of people think that is the best of these 3, whereas for me, that was the worst one, and the other 2 were much better. I think I was prompted, for whatever reason, to do a lot of rereading this year, because the next book on the list is A Passage to India by E.M. Forster. A Passage to India is a novel that explores the relationship between British and Indian people in India during the British Raj. It focuses on Adela Quested and Mrs. Moore, 2 British women who come to India as Adela is supposed to marry a young man there. Their relationship is one of the themes of the story, and it often is put into tension, partly because they're not really designed for each other, but also because the man in this relationship, whose name I can't remember right now, he is sort of changed by being in India, and he's turned quite bitter by what goes on there, and he becomes not a very nice person. Adela is a bit more idealistic and naive about the relationships between England and India, but throughout the course of the novel, she realises that things aren't as rosy as she thought, and her visions of India are not as romantic as she thought, because these are actually real people with their own lives. Her life gets thrown into turmoil when she accuses an Indian man, Dr. Aziz, of assaulting her when she's in these mysterious caves called the Marabar Caves. This causes a really big trial. It's very dramatic, a little bit reminiscent of To Kill a Mockingbird, but it goes differently, and things resolve somewhat well, but there's always this residual tension between even 2 of the closest friends in the story, Mr. Fielding, who is a teacher in India, and Dr. Aziz, partly caused by this rift created by Adela's accusation. If you want an interesting, complex book about colonisation, then I would recommend this story. I like again that Forster focuses very much on the personal rather than just the sort of political situation, because I find political books to be quite dry often, and they often abstract away from the real lives of the people living in a political situation, and they often tend to simplify things into, sort of binary relationships of oppressor and oppressed, and Forster doesn't quite do that. He really does focus on the personal conflicts of the characters living in this situation. And so you do have characters that are, racist or bigoted, but you also have characters that move beyond that have good friendships, but also there's this residual tension due to the political situation. And I think that Forster does this in a very sensitive way and a very interesting one. It's also just a very well written book, which is no surprise, it's Forster. And it's a shame really that he stopped writing books after this, because I'm sure he could have written a lot more, and his writing was really was getting better with every book as well. Some of the ways that he describes India, especially this scene early on in the book with Mrs. Moore and Dr. Aziz when they meet each other in a mosque, it's just beautiful writing, some of the best writing that I've ever come across. So if you want a book that is interesting, has complex characters, has a complex political situation, but most importantly, is beautifully written, then I would definitely recommend this book. Next up we have two Shakespeare plays, Henry IV, Part 1 and Part 2. These plays focus on not so much Henry IV, but his son, Prince Hal, who is somewhat a runaway. He runs away from his responsibilities, especially in the first part, to hang around with the enigmatic, larger-than-life Falstaff character, who is basically a sort of rogue, a rake, a very large man, just, generally into debauchery and not being a great person, but being hilarious while he's doing it. There's some great comedy, especially in Part 1 with Falstaff, and these two work together quite well as a couple, but you can see even in the first part that Hal is somewhat cruel towards Falstaff. There's this great scene when Falstaff pretends to be Hal, and you can tell that he's doing it in a way that is jokey, whereas when Hal does the same for Falstaff, you get the impression that he's not really being jokey, and he's actually being quite serious in his insulting. And so it's no surprise then in Part 2, when we get Hal eventually accepting his kingly responsibility, arguably a little bit too quickly, and then turning on Falstaff and rejecting him entirely. It's a great pair of plays. I think history doesn't look too kindly on Part 2. I think usually Part 1 is seen as a great play and Part 2 is seen as flawed, partly because Falstaff and Hal aren't really together in it all that much, but I disagree. I think they work really well together. I also like how we get to focus on Henry IV a little bit more in Part 2. He gets terminally ill and dies, and he has some reflections on what it is to be a king that mirror some things that are said in another play, Richard II. And in Richard II, for those of you who don't know, that is the play in which Henry IV gets the throne by usurping it from Richard II. And it's nice to see sort of the tables turning on Henry IV. Next up we have the bizarrest book that I read this year, and that is House of Leaves by Mark Danielewski. The framing device of this story is we have a young man called Johnny Truant, a troubled young man who comes across this manuscript written by a dead academic called Zampano. And this manuscript is an analysis of a film that was made by the Navidson family about their house, which seemed to be bigger on the inside than it was on the outside. And so we get Zampano's commentary on the film that this family made as they explore this house and things get darker and more scary. But then we also have Johnny Truant's commentary on this, and sometimes tangents where he rambles about his personal life and his personal problems. And as the story unravels, the Navidson family, things get more insane, Zampano gets more insane, and so does Johnny. And so this sort of layering results in a very bizarrely written book. Sometimes you have to turn the pages upside down, sometimes there's just one word on a page, sometimes pages are black, sometimes there's bits missing, things are crossed out. It's an absolute mess because it's simulating this manuscript written by a nutter about this crazy film that people talked about but then don't talk about anymore. It's sort of implied that maybe this is all made up, or maybe it isn't. It's unclear. We get some hilarious parodies of real life people, one of my personal favourites being Camille Parlier, who pops up in this book, and the sort of spoof of her is quite amusing. And so we get all of this stuff going on, and it's hilarious in a lot of ways, but it's also incredibly disturbing and scary. If you want to challenge yourself with a read and you like horror, especially sort of more sort of bizarre horror, then I think you should definitely give this book a try. And last on the list we have The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie by Muriel Spark. So I actually was interested in reading this book because I watched the film with Maggie Smith, and that was inspired by her death and people sharing a clip from this film where she's giving a sort of high-minded lecture to the principal of her school about what a great teacher she is, even though she has unconventional methods. And what's interesting is, if you just watch that clip, you would assume that that's what this story is about, a teacher that has these methods, and ultimately they're good methods, but that's not the case. Instead, it's about the narcissism of teachers and the way that they can influence children and lead them astray. Mrs. Jean Brodie is a great teacher in a lot of ways. She has great ideals, she wants her kids to be cultured, and she sees education as being more about just learning facts. All those things are great, but she also creates this cult around her as well. She has what she calls her Brodie girls, which are just a subset of her class, and they're particular girls that she grooms essentially into becoming a part of her clique. And she's not very nice to her other students. She sees these girls as special, she treats them to things like taking them to see films and art galleries and all of this, and she sort of manipulates them in a lot of ways as well. And so slowly through the story we get these girls realising that Miss Brodie is not the Wonder Woman that they thought, and this ultimately leads to her being betrayed by one of her girls. The novel is slightly different from the film as well because it's told in retrospect, and so we know a little bit more about what happens to Miss Brodie long after the events of the novel, whereas the film just focuses on a sort of linear story ending with the betrayal. And I liked that the book did that. It just gives a little bit more insight into how these girls turn out, where they go, and I thought it was really well written and I enjoyed it a lot. It's a very short book, so I'd recommend it if you've watched the film and you want to give the book a go. Give it a try because they are quite different beasts. The book is a little bit darker in a lot of ways. It deals a bit more with how the girls end up as well, in a way that the film doesn't really engage with, and it gets into the psychology of the girls a little bit more as well. Overall, it's a great little novel, and it does capture something true about teaching, which is that when you're a teacher, you have all of these kids looking to you, and that can be a little bit of an ego trip in the sense that these kids think that you're so wise and so clever, and so you can use that power to manipulate them and to make yourself feel good, rather than necessarily doing what's right for the children. Alright, that is it for this list of the best books that I read last year. Let me know down in the comments, what books did you enjoy reading the most last year? What books didn't you like reading, if any? And let me know what you're looking forward to reading in the new year as well. Take care everyone, Happy New Year, ta-ra.